of the content development cycle, something we are all engaged with at some point and in some capacities, and which anchors our topic for today, types of reviews in technical communication. So I already had a very nice introduction. This is a little bit more about me. I'm currently concentrating these days on training and mentoring other communication professionals. And I have done some instruction at the university level as well. Endorsements of my work here, it was all fun stuff and lots of work. Which brings us to our objectives for today's training. So first, I'd like for us to take a high-level look at the content development cycle and the role that technical editing.
Debra, sorry, are you moving your screen or?
I am advancing my screen. I'm on slide 4 right now.
No, right now I can still see the first screen only that you started sharing.
Okay, so we might have a communication issue.
Yeah, now it's moving. Now I can see training objectives.
All right, so let me.
Please go ahead.
All right. Okay, let me do my switcheroo here.
No, this is interesting. Now again, it's not moving.
All right, well, let me just go from this view.
Yeah.
And we'll go from here. And this is a little bit more distracting, and I apologize for that, but if it works, it works. Right?
All right. Yeah.
All right. Okay. So we were talking about training objectives. So I'd like to start with you guys thinking about the role of technical editing and especially the evolution of technical editing with its position with respect to the content development cycle. Then I'm going to move into talking about 6 types of reviews that you might encounter as in a technical communications environment. We'll talk about the inputs to those types of reviews that you can expect to have to do, and then the kind of feedback that you should expect back during those reviews. And we'll talk a little bit about how you can manage those reviews and work successfully with your content reviewers. And I'll wrap up with some summary about the best type of review and how to maybe cut back or cut down on reviews. I will try to wind up today's session with talking about a common error that I have seen over my years of experience as a technical editor, but we may or may not have time for that. So I'd love to come back sometime if we don't. So let's get started. So the definition of a technical editor that you see on this screen is actually lifted from the 2003 edition of the Style Guide from Sun Microsystems, where I was a technical editor and a marketing communications manager. And that style guide, by the way, in case you can't read it on the screen, is called Read Me First, a style guide for the computer industry. And that was actually its published title, and it was published and available at one time. It was available on Amazon as well as some other sites. But the definition that you're looking at right now is really rather old and dated. And that's because sometimes in our technical communications department, we don't have somebody with the title technical editor. And there's a lot of reason for that. And part of that has to do with some of the evolution I'd like to talk about. As Michelle Corbin talks about in a recent column that she wrote for Intercom, which is one of the magazines that the Society for Technical Communication publishes, she says that the definition of technical editing has expanded to beyond just words. It now includes, for instance, the consideration of online experience, the tone of voice in a video, the readability of an infographic. And she argues that to assist in these different areas now, this expanded area, the technical review process, the technical editing process actually needs to move upstream and start earlier even during a design phase. So let's talk about phases a little bit. So this is a very busy slide. You see various representations on this slide of the content development or documentation life cycle. Some are circles and some are flowcharts, but the details are not important. What I'd like you to see here is that the content development cycle, well, it seems to some of us to have become faster, and it actually has also become more complex. Faster because we're all sometimes working in a very agile environment because the product development team is working in an agile environment. But more complex because there are more and more roles engaging in the content development cycle. So as mentioned earlier, I was a content strategist. That's a fairly new role. There are customer experience experts. There's a UX team sometimes involved. And that's an interesting, I think, kind of evolution. But one characteristic I think you can observe in all of these, if you see all of the arrows on the screen, is that these charts capture the idea of iteration. So our documentation process has become very, very iterative. So why this evolution and why this engagement in iteration? In some respects, it does have to do with those new agile methodologies in project management and product development, especially software development. Move fast, review, iterate, rinse, repeat, right? But in other ways, it very much has to do with the evolution of quality management. The idea is that as we move up and as we iterate, we move up and up a quality scale to reach the highest quality we can. On this slide is one definition of what quality content is. It meets the audience needs in the most effective way, and it has other characteristics like it's accurate, it's consistent, it's useful, it speaks with one voice, it achieves business goals. But I really want you to think about how you would define quality content and how your team seeks quality. How do you get there? So one aside here to underscore the idea of iteration, I want to share a quotation here from Tom Johnson. I think some of you guys know him. I think he also presented it to this group. And he just wants to remind us here with this quotation from one of his very fine articles, is that the achievement of quality content doesn't stop with engineering approval. Okay, it's something much bigger than that. So let's move into what I believe are the 6 common types, or the 6 types of reviews that you will probably encounter in your career. That doesn't mean that every single piece of content that you write is going to go through all 6 of these reviews. That's unless it's very complex and very technical, that's not likely. But at some point you will encounter likely at least a few of these reviews as you produce your content. And the idea here is that if you start on the lower left and move around the tree here to the right, you'll see that there are several different types of reviews and checks and edits. And again, the typical approach or the typical experience is that your content will go through at least one review and one check before it is released. And this is according to my friend Kip Brown-Hoska, who wrote about reviews for Intercom as well. We'll go through each of these definitions in a little bit more detail. And I want to also mention that in our professional reference book, the Technical Communication Today, which came out in its 5th edition, it mentions levels of edit. And these are not quite the same thing, but they do have some commonalities. The biggest question I encounter is, does the content have to be complete at each stage? And I'll talk about this a little bit more, but the answer is no, not necessarily. And we'll talk about how and what that might look like. Another question I get is, do these reviews have to happen sequentially or focus on the entire set of content or the entire document? And again, the answer is no, not necessarily, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. So content reviews, content edits don't happen in a vacuum. Most of them are dependent on documented departmental or project standards of some kind. I list 4 types here. Not everybody is calling their department resources by these terms: style guide, information model, taxonomy, or content strategy. But I'm willing to bet that your department has elements of these in some kind of form documented somewhere. And remember that your style guide isn't necessarily just going to talk about punctuation. It's also probably going to give you some guidance for word usage and maybe even some guidance on standards for glossaries and standards for graphics and stuff like that. If your department, or if you're a single person department and you don't have a style guide that's documented somewhere, there are plenty of resources available to you. One of the most commonly used style guides that's published and available is the Microsoft Manual of Style for Technical Publications. There's also the Read Me First, a style guide for the computer industry that I mentioned a couple of slides ago. There are other resources like the Chicago Manual of Style. One of my favorite resources is the little brown handbook, this little compact tabbed handbook that lets me look up some punctuation and grammar points whenever I lose my mind and forget. So that's sort of an introduction to where we're going. I do want to transition here into a little deeper dive and give you an opportunity to maybe think about how your department approaches some reviews and how they maybe align with these different types. So the first type I'm going to talk about is not one that's very, very common. It's called the developmental edit. When I was a content strategist at Oracle, I also wore the hat of developmental editor. And I did that for Sun Microsystems for a short time as well. So let's talk about the developmental edit. Some people also call this, by the way, a substantive edit. And it is typically performed by an editor or a lead writer or even your manager. Your inputs to a developmental edit is to have a content strategy in place, whether you wrote it or the lead writer on your team wrote it or your manager wrote it. You will have conducted at this point most of your research, and you will have begun drafting. So you will have as your input your content strategy document, which describes the audience, the purpose, and the requirements for the content. And you will have done your reviews of product specs, your reviews of JIRA stories, your interviews with your product experts just to get some input initially. And you will deliver basically a rough draft that outlines all the content that you plan to deliver to the project. And that draft would represent the project, your content project's logic, including all of the headings and subheadings. It might include some content, such as introductions, and it probably should contain also a list of the intended graphics or media. And I say a little bit of content and introductory content. You don't have to draft. You've got an outline. You don't have to draft things in order. You can draft section 4 first out of 6 sections, say, for example. What do you want to get out of a developmental edit from your developmental editor or your manager or whomever? You really want to get an evaluation of the logic and the completeness of what you plan. You can also maybe get some feedback on style and wording choices if that's something that you want to check, particularly if you're working closely with an editor or a manager. So what you're going to get back is feedback on sequencing, on the way you categorized things or the way you worded headings, whether or not you have all of the headings that somebody would expect, all of the level of detail that somebody would expect. So a developmental edit, you want to seek the answers to these questions. Does the content all fit together in a coherent whole? Is the order of presentation logical from the target audience's point of view? Is all the necessary information included? Have you planned sufficiently for all of the media that you plan to include? And does the content meet those audience and content requirements in the planning documents? So as an example, I wanted to share with you a developmental edit that I did which was basically conducted as a table of contents edit. So this is the table of contents, or the navigation proposed for an expansion of a website tab. And you can see here in the items that are outlined in dark gray that I have asked this author to include a few more details about jobs. And I thought that was important to expand the last section of her bit about backup and restore jobs. I also, in the lighter gray, made some suggestions about content that might be coming her way that I knew about from the meetings that I had been attending. And she just wants to have placeholders there for that future content. And then on the lower right is a place where I suggested that she break out a section of content into a separately headed section that could be then reused on another tab. So that's developmental edit. Moving into a more common type of edit is the author's check, or the author's self-edit. So inputs to that. I do recommend that you do your self-edit at a place where you're about a third of the way through your drafting. And I also encourage you to do it every time you turn over your draft to somebody else to review. You want to do it, and I'm recommending 1/3 of the way through, because you don't want to get too far into your drafting process and realize, oh my gosh, I'm using the wrong term, or oh my gosh, I was tagging something totally differently than what I should have been, or the graphics don't fit, or the graphics don't load. You don't want to have those panicked kind of moments later on. So I do suggest that you stop and do this kind of review for yourself. And you're going to use your style guide and your information model and your taxonomy and your checking tools as part of your process. You do want to check your headings, your captions, your links, and obviously your text. You want to make sure that your graphics are working where you anticipate that they work. And then you want to make sure that when you're reviewing your draft, that you make the recommendation that most experts in the field of editing make is that you review your draft in a format other than your authoring tool. So if you've got an opportunity to output your HTML to a staging server, or you've got an opportunity to output to PDF or just print your draft, that is a better mode for you to do your self-checking than trying to review it in your authoring tool on the screen. If you have to do that, at the very least, turn your tagging off. I also recommend that you leave enough time. So I wouldn't recommend that you do a self-edit at the end of the day when you're tired and anxious and you're hungry, or hangry, as the term might be. So do allow enough time. So what should you look for? I would hope that you would want to look for and correct those gross errors, but you also want to look for inconsistencies and complication where it doesn't need to be. So yes, go ahead and correct your spellos and your typos and your extra periods and your missing commas. That gives you a feeling of accomplishment in my mind, but also look for those awkward sentences or those overly long or overly complex paragraphs and sentences. The best way to catch those kinds of corrections, by the way, is if you've got an especially long paragraph or especially complex set of sentences, is to simply read them aloud. So lock yourself in a closet, go in another room, go outside, and read the passage aloud and listen to how it sounds to you, because that's the way your user is probably going to perceive it. Another method that I recommend for self-checking, and it works, I do this all the time, is to start with your very last sentence, either on the page or in the document itself, and read each successive sentence backwards towards the beginning. And what that does is sort of reprogram your brain a little bit so that you're focusing on each sentence individually and not mentally filling in blanks as you're reading something in order. Works all the time for me. Also, you want to use your code validator and make sure just that you've got things tagged correctly during your self-edit. Here's an example of a self-edit using a tool. So this is a passage from a friend's scientific paper, and I ran it through Grammarly Premium. It's a grammar checker and spell checker. And you notice a couple of things here. The checker picked up on the fact that he used the word statues, which is a real word, when he meant statutes, meaning regulations. But this grammar checker, and I love Grammarly, I use it, but it's not necessarily the best checker for someone who isn't familiar with grammatical terms. So it tells him here really vaguely to rephrase a sentence, and it tells him to correct a comma splice. And he may not know what that is, so this might not have been the best choice of tool for him, although it may work perfectly well for you. Just as for grins here is the same passage after it has been edited, and I helped him with this. And I used in the first sentence some parallel structure to help improve readability, and that kind of met that requirement for rephrasing. I also split the really long second sentence into two sentences, one very short sentence and one longer sentence, and that took care of the comma splice comment. And we also added some missing punctuation here. I'm sorry, did somebody have a question? Okay. All right.
Yeah, Debra, we have one question. You want to take that?
All right. Go ahead.
Yeah, so Gayatri asks, when there is a difference of perspective between that of an editor and of a writer, which version should make it to the final draft? The writer knows the product and hence has a certain construction. The editor has a certain perspective. How do we resolve this conflict?
Well, I guess I don't look at it as a conflict. Hopefully it's a partnership. In this particular instance, I had no idea what my friend Bob was really writing about. But what I could do was show him some examples of ways to resolve the problem that the grammar checker put forth or highlighted for us. I think in the case of the, if you feel like there's a conflict, the best way is to have a conversation and work on the sentence together. If that's not possible because the editor is a contractor or somewhere removed, you might want to bring in a third party, but you're the one who knows what's going to work. Use your techniques for reading out loud, reading backwards. Make sure that you are meeting the user requirements and the content requirements in your planning. And you make the decision, because I'm in your situation. I don't know if the editor has is in some sort of hierarchy structure that's higher than you in the pecking order. But if that's true, be respectful of their position. But I would say the call is yours. Does that help?
Thanks, Debra. Gayatri, that's good for you? Yeah.
Yes, Debra, thank you. Thanks.
Okay, great. All right. So I did want to take a quick aside here, I'm talking about style checkers and grammar checkers and spell checkers. Please remember that they're helpful. As we saw, they can be helpful on certain levels, but they're not infallible. The best ones that I have found, the most useful ones that I have found, are the ones that are programmable to your team style, to your team's set of word choices. At Oracle, we used Acrolinks, which is a programmable style guideline checker. I liked it because instead of just telling me I had to rephrase a sentence, it would actually give me some options on sentences that would work instead of the one that I had chosen. You do sometimes maybe need a second person to help you interpret grammatical feedback from some of these spell checkers. Hopefully you'll get used to that and can respond on, without that extra help. But sometimes it just helps to have somebody else say, well, here's another way of, you could rephrase that and maybe it would be a little less complex for your reader. I always recommend that you have a backup copy of your content before you run it through a style checker or a grammar checker, because I think that you always want to have the option to revert back to where you were. So I'm going to go ahead and move into probably the most complex review here. Do we have any more questions?
Not now, Debra.
Okay. All right. So the most complex review, or the most challenging review you might participate in and have to prepare for, is an expert review. So I want to spend a little bit of time on this. I'm recommending that you engage your reviewer in a more formal review when you're about 50 to 60% done with your content. Hopefully you have been working with your experts all along as you've been drafting your comment, but you might want to set a point and agree on a point at which they will do a more formal review. And of course that depends on their availability. I'm hoping that the content won't be completely done, because I think there's a risk in that. If you've gotten too far off course technically, you're going to have to really scramble to do some modifications, probably in a short amount of time, on a whole lot of content. So pick a good point that works for you. Check on their availability. Invite them to a formal review, have start and end dates, and then set up the document in a formal review tool if you have the opportunity to do that. It's in a PDF, an Acrobat, for instance, or in an online situation where it's a staging server. If you have to work with many reviewers all at the same time and you're short on time, I do recommend that you just go ahead and set up the document in a Zoom call or an online call, or set everybody, if you have the luxury of sitting everybody in a room and it's not in the middle of a pandemic, and do it an old-fashioned page turn. So get everybody on that call and go through section by section what their input is, and that will save you time, and it'll also help the reviewers also engage each other, and you might actually improve the product. Who knows? You do want to make sure, and I'm going to say this over and again, that you have proofread your content before you put it in front of an expert, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. Ensure that the graphics are viewable for them in some form. Maybe even if you don't have them integrated in the text, you have them somewhere else. You also might want to use that review copy that you're working with to incorporate questions that you still have about the technical aspect of the product or service that you're documenting. I would caution that you limit your questions to half a dozen or so. You don't want to overwhelm and turn off your reviewer, right? You want to keep that relationship going. You've hopefully built it, and you're at a good point now where you want to turn it over to them for a review. So what do you want them to look at? So before I go into this list here, I want to make sure that I explain that I'm using the term expert review as an umbrella term to cover both the idea of a subject matter expert review or technical review or a legal review. And the purpose of this review really is to get your reviewers to focus on their areas of expertise. And what you get, the kind of feedback that you'll get back will depend on their area of expertise. So what you want to get back from the experts are things like interface details that you missed, or tool details that are still needed. You might get some rewording suggestions, particularly on cautions and warnings, for example. Remember that you always have the power to manage these reviews and ask them to focus on a particular set of task steps, or a particular interface description, or a particular set of prerequisites. But they might make some suggestions in addition to what you've asked them to focus on. Always take those with a grain of salt. I also list here that you might end up with some rewrites to your sentence, particularly if they've you've run your expert review through the legal department. And I actually had to do that not only when I was a technical editor for Sun Microsystems, Sun Education programs, but also when I was a communications manager for Sun's Quality Group. Both areas had a lot of concern for legal. You might also get some updates to graphics. That's wonderful, particularly if they've changed the interface. Your legal reviewer might also ask you to change some things regarding trademarking. So let's take a look at those kinds of feedback. Here's an example of a set of feedback that was rolled out to us as the kind of feedback that the legal department would have given to us in Sun Ed's group as we ran our educational content, workbooks, and the user guides through a legal review. The first two sentences here, really what they've done is reworded the sentence to accommodate the trademarking rule for the particular product that we were talking about. So it's Java. It's not just Java, it's Java programming language. So we always had to use that now. In the second sentence here, what you see is the legal department coming back with the criticism of an overly broad promise. They also didn't like the word will. So we never were allowed, in Sun Educational Services, we were never allowed to use the word will. So that's just an example of the kind of feedback that you might get from a legal department. And you might want to, negotiate maybe a little bit with. So let's talk a little bit about that. One of the things you need to determine if you do have to run your content through a legal review, and like I said, there were two different places in my career where I had to, is whether those legal comments are considered mandatory or are they considered advisory in your department. In the case of Sun Ed, those were advisory comments that we got back, the ones that I just showed you. When I worked in Sun's Quality Group as a communications manager, that feedback on that content, because it was about quality, was considered mandatory. You might get challenged, like I showed you in that second sentence on the previous slide, when a claim is made, to maybe substantiate that claim. Where does that come from? Who made that claim? But remember, you can always, if they're giving you a lot of feedback on language, you can always negotiate if it's an advisory situation, and come back with some suggestions about what their advice might better meet your users' requirements and your team's style guide. Always pay attention also to any markups that legal has to warnings and cautions and to trademark placement, because you want to make sure that you carry those through to your additional sections of your documentation effort. So let's talk a little bit about subject matter experts, because that's where everything kind of comes together for us. Your subject matter expert really is your partner and collaborator. If we continue to think of them in that way, maybe some of those those conflicts don't seem quite so that can come up don't seem quite so concerning. So I did put together a list here of some ideas for working with your subject matter experts that come from my experience. Again, remember, if you go into a subject matter review, your technical review, with the attitude that this person is your partner and your collaborator. Think of them as a human being, even if they don't seem like it sometimes. Be respectful of their time and knowledge. So they are busy. They have a certain level of expertise and a certain level of knowledge of the product that maybe you don't yet have. So always come in with a good attitude. But don't give them an excuse to nitpick your language or nitpick your writing. And that goes back to proofreading, so make sure you've proofread, you don't have those obvious errors like double periods. But also make sure that you're able to focus them. So again, manage your review, focus them in on, I want feedback on these set of prerequisites. I want feedback on this feature description. And as they give you that feedback, remember their language is not necessarily going to be the language of your audience. You always are going to be in that role of the interpreter, the translator of the technical to what your audience needs. And remember, as they start to expound and explain to you how a feature was programmed or how the internals work, that's not necessarily the kind of detail always, and it's not always the kind of detail that your audience needs. It may be interesting to you, and maybe it could go into a theory of operation or whatever, but you are there to gather the details that the audience needs. And you can remind your reviewer of that as well. Always take the opportunity to check your assumptions. So in your questions, you can ask that. At this point in the set of tasks, I assume that the user is trying to accomplish X, Y, and Z. Is that true, Mr. Reviewer? So take that opportunity. And as I mentioned earlier, working with multiple subject matter experts on a technical review can be very challenging. So remember my advice about maybe doing a group review. And not only will cut back on some time for you, but it might be some interesting discussion. And you also want to make sure that you're facilitating that and using your facilitation skills. Because I genuinely believe that as technical communicators, we bring those kind of skills to the table, and maybe not all of our subject matter experts have those kind of skills. So I'm going to transition now into the 3 additional types of reviews. I wanted to double check that we have any more questions.
One question, Debra, when we talk about SMEs, so for SMEs, many times when we go for input, so they share a lot of information, and almost all the information they request, not actually request, but actually they want that information to be in the document, because so it's like the conflict is not the conflict, I can say conflict, information versus input, because input is what we want to present in the document, and they share a lot of information. So in that case, do you have any recommendation, okay, take information from them, but without hurting them, just include the input in the documentation? So any recommendation for that?
Yeah, there's several different ways to handle that. I do know what you mean. Honestly, I do. Even in my most recent job, one of the things that you can do is well, go ahead and clarify your assumptions. Use your facilitation skills, but you might want to suggest that the content that they're wanting to include could go elsewhere, into a white paper or into a theory of operations section in another document. So it's not that it's bad information. It can often be very interesting and even enlightening information, but always take your reviewer back to what your audience needs. remind them this is for us, is for our service organization. This is for our maintenance guys. And when they're trying to get something done in a short amount of time, and they've only got 15 more things to do that day, they don't want to read a theory of operation. So always bring them back to their audience. You can very gently suggest that the kind of information that they're giving you belongs elsewhere too. Does that help?
Yep. Thank you.
Yeah, that's a tough one. It really is. I appreciate you guys asking.
Yeah.
It's a tough one. It is. You have to be a good, gentle person with your facilitation skills and be non-threatening and all of that.
Right.
Let's talk a little bit about this idea of peer reviews, because this is interesting. So a peer review is what, at least at Oracle, and I think you guys have probably already seen this too, is what used to be called a copy edit. At Oracle, we didn't do copy edits, we did peer reviews. So let me see if, I'm interested to hear if you guys have experienced this too. So a peer review is what used to be a copy edit. When you turn your draft over to someone who is probably not familiar with the content that you've been writing about, and you ask them to review it, and usually it's very close to being done. So I say here at least 90% done. You might be waiting on a graphic, or you might be waiting for me to give you some input on a particular section. And it is a writing standards review. And it's based on your department's standards and guidelines documents, so your style guide and your taxonomy and your content strategy. As I said before, you know, you want to proofread, but you also want to make sure that you're complete as possible, and explain in places where you're not complete. And that includes your indexing and your metadata, so that it's all there to be proofread as well, and your graphics. You might, because you're dealing with someone who's never read this topic before, is not as familiar with it as you are, you're probably going to end up having some discussion. So make sure that you allow some time for that. This, as I said, this type of edit used to be done by a copy editor. And that used to be a real role on a team, believe it or not. There used to be a role on a technical comms team called a copy editor, or sometimes it was contracted out. That certainly was true at Oracle. But more and more, this is something that this is a draft that you turn over to your peer, someone on your team. And in small, and there's actually some good thinking about it in my mind. This is kind of an interesting evolution to me. Because if everybody's kind of reviewing everybody else's content, and again, there has to be some time allowed for this, then really what you're doing is kind of expanding, as a manager at least, what you're doing is kind of expanding the knowledge area of each of your people on your team. If you have a small or a medium-sized team, if everybody's reading everybody else's content, you're kind of doing some education of your team as well. And at the same time, again, looking at it from a manager's point of view, you're keeping your team sort of on their toes with the style guide. So they're refamiliarizing themselves with the style guide and the expectations for the document, because they're having to do fill that role for somebody else. So it's an interesting kind of evolution, I think. This kind of edit looks at the presentation aspects of the written and graphical content, specifically for clarity and consistency and style. In other words, the focus is on the way the content is presented, not necessarily the content itself. So it included everything in mechanics like acronym use and punctuation, to grammar, caption style, whether terminology is consistent, whether capitalization is consistent, whether it's consistent with the style guide for those things. But you also might want to, you might get some feedback on some of those complex sentences and complex paragraphs, and maybe some feedback on some consistency. But the guiding light here is always your set of expectations that was in your department standards or your project standards. So here's an example of a peer review that I did of a document that was prepared by a team member, a peer of mine. Actually, it was for a wiki, but she turned it into a PDF for review purposes. And you can see I've captured some style things here, like missing periods, a comma that's outside of a quotation mark instead of inside. But I've also made some suggestions where I thought that the content would work better. So the row in the table, for instance, I'm just asking her, wouldn't this work better if it were a sentence somewhere else? And I also caught her not necessarily using our style format for table captions. So this is the kind of things that we would do, at least when we would do a peer review, right? We weren't necessarily arguing with the content as much as looking at some of the way it was presented. So a little bit of advice here from my experience in working with peers in this idea of a peer being a copy editor. And yeah, the comic down there is kind of fun. I lifted that from somewhere else. Because the focus of this peer review, peer copy edit is clarity and consistency in style. Remember, that might mean different things to different people. So it's always best, and you can do this yourself, if you're turning your document over to a peer to review, that you're both working from a common checklist for style and grammar and what's expected. Here's what's expected as you review this content. And you can create this for yourself, for your department, or just for your own document as you turn it over. And in the same words that I used for the expert review actually apply here too, and that's respect and substantiation. So when you're marking up someone else's work, always have a reason, point back to the checklist, point back to the style guide. And with respect to grammar, if you're looking at grammar in your copy edit, remember to focus on grammar the grammar that's essential to the clarity of the document for conveying the idea clearly, such as a subject-verb agreement error, that might be, or ambiguity. You don't necessarily want to fall into the trap of enforcing fake grammar rules like the split infinitive, to boldly go. Nobody cares. And it's not really interfering with the clarity of the content. Be respectful of their time and urgency. I mentioned respect. Remember that the author is going to know more about the topic than you do. So ask your questions and respond to questions in a sensitive way. And this is me talking. Usually when I ask a question, I always put myself in the question itself. So I don't really understand this sentence. Is a word missing here? Or is the punctuation not working right here? So always, that's one way to sort of be a little bit more sensitive in asking your questions. And then of course, always remember that they might be your reviewer one day. So I'm going to move into the fifth of 6 review types here, and that's the tagging or code check. And this is kind of obvious. I don't really need to spend a lot of time here, but your coding check could actually be done by somebody else at the same time that your peer review is doing your copy editing. The two can be done simultaneously, so keep that in mind as well. Your inputs are going to be your information model, where all whatever your guide is for how you tag things. You can obviously approach this in 2 ways. You can use a code validation tool, or you could possibly, if you have the opportunity, submit it to an information architect or some architect on your team. They're going to proofread. You make sure that you proofread all your tags for your headings and your links and your text. Make sure that your graphics and your links are accurately named, accurately referenced, and accurately tagged, because that inevitably becomes the downfall. And you also want to include all of your metadata and your index, because the tagging there probably should also be complete or looked at. Obviously, you're going to get back tagging corrections, comments about missing tags, often missing if you're in HTML, at least in my world, sometimes will miss an end tag. You might, if people are looking closely at your metadata and your indexing, there might be some ideas about how that could be set up a little bit differently. So you might get feedback in that way. And people are probably going to also check to see that your links and navigation tagging is working correctly. So on this screen, it's kind of an eye chart. I'm sorry, it might have shown up better if we were using the slideshow. But this is really output from, there's lots of code validators out there. These are two that are code validators that are free and online, or at least low cost for XML. XML Buddy is one on the left, and if you I know you can't probably read it. A Code Project is the one on the right, and basically this is going to give you back some feedback about is the right one. The one on the right shows an invalid element, an invalid child element inside of a larger tag, is an example. Just a quick word about code checkers and code validators. Again, the best ones out there are going to be the kinds that you can program to your own schema, your own information model. At Oracle, we used Schematron, which was a code checker for our DITA. We used DITA in our group at Oracle. The challenge with Schematron was that it was actually being administered by another group, and we always had to put in change requests to another group to get it to actually follow our model. So it wasn't the most popular tool in our organization. I don't know if you've had that experience. Often it was much easier for the authors to send a GUID to our information architect and say, could you take a look at the tagging here? Did I get everything right? So it was a little bit more informal. But there are lots of code validators out there for JSON and HTML too. Our sixth and final review here, and that's production check. And again, this one is fairly obvious. It may or may not be something that your department does. That's okay. Sometimes we just do this check ourselves. But it is really the idea that you're 100% done with your documentation. You followed your production process. You've done all of your checking. You wanted to have incorporated all of the changes that you got back from all of your reviews and then proofread them, especially those places where you did some more extensive changes. You want to make sure that after you reviews, you have updated all of your metadata and your index entries. And then, produce the content following your production process. Put your footers in, your watermarks, or whatever. It should be in your final format. And then do a check or hand it over to somebody else to do it. And this is something that we had as a process at Oracle. I realized not everybody did. Often, and we did do this, we did have this at Oracle, at least in the very initial beginnings when I was there. Sometimes this production check is actually done by another organization in the company because they're responsible for the website or the repository or whatever, where this content is actually going to be shown to the user. Oftentimes then it will be done by the production coordinator in that organization. Sometimes if it's internal, it'll just be a member of your team. It's easier if somebody else does it, right? Because they want to check that those footers are there, that the watermarks are there, that the links are working, that the index and metadata is publishing the way they should, and that there are no broken graphics or graphics that aren't loading properly or aren't printing properly if it's a printed document. So that's the kind of things that you would expect to be checked in a production check. Here's an example, a quick example, same writer, by the way, where she is producing a PDF to be put on a website. And if you notice here, I caught a couple of style things. She still didn't correct her table caption. But she also had a couple of things that she might not have been able to check on her own, like a broken link. That's not something that's easy to do inside of an authoring system. It's only something really that would show up in a production check. So I did notice one broken link here. And then she did miss a step in her publishing process, and she forgot a footer. So that's an example of the kind of feedback that I gave her. So I'm kind of wrapping up here. I'm conscious of the time. I do have some final thoughts. Should I pause here or for questions, or should I just go ahead and finish up?
You can go ahead and then we will take up the question.
Okay. All right, so it's kind of putting everything together. Again, not every piece of content is going to go through all 6 reviews all the time. Nor should you probably expect that that happens very regularly. But here's a sort of a visual of the 6 types of reviews that you could encounter, even in one piece of documentation, and then how they might fall in a drafting process. So your rough draft, your second draft, and your third and your middle drafts are where you're going to do your expert reviews and your peer reviews and your tagging reviews. And again, notice some of those can be done simultaneously, and then at the very end, when you're 100% done, your production review. So this is just a visual for you to see how those things might line up and how they might overlap. So let's get to the question I'm anticipating somebody's going to ask about, well, how do I adjust the types of reviews and the number of reviews to my content or to the needs of my department? And I do have some advice here for you, again, based on my experience. And the first one is never skip a necessary review for really vital, I say life-saving content here. And the best example that I've heard of that is you don't want to skip a set of reviews for the instructions for the life support system on the space station, right? That's pretty important. If you do have to save time, though, remember I said that some reviews could be done in tandem rather than sequentially. So you could do your code check with your information architect at the same time that you're doing a peer review, or you've sent your copy to your peer to review. Another thing that you can do to save time is maybe to conduct small sections of your document, send them through reviews over time. So you're doing just a small section at a time. So you could combine that with the tandem idea. So you could have a piece of content that you're still working. If you divided your project into thirds, you can still have a piece of content that you're working on and developing while your expert is reviewing the technical aspects of another section of your project. And you could have the very first piece of the project that you worked on and sent through an expert review now involved in a peer review. So there's ways to save time to do these ideas and do things in tandem and do things in small sections. You also want to make sure that you match the type of review or the level of edit, which is our popular term when we used it in microsystems, to the kind of content. So if the content is temporary and has little impact, maybe it just goes through a legal review and a copy edit. If it's not overly technical or complex, nor is it high impact, you might want to, again, simplify your sets of reviews. If it's something that has to be verbatim, like an audio script, again, copy edit, and maybe that's all you do. If it's something that's meant to show personality, like a blog and not a formal document, again, maybe it's something simple. The question that you always want to ask is, what is the level of quality needed? And adjust your thinking to that. Final thoughts, there might be lots of other reviews that you will have encountered in your career. I certainly have design reviews, usability testing, translation memory check, or even a press check at a blue line or an artboard stage. My recommendation is no matter what kind of reviews you're involved in, always take the opportunity to learn and improve, right? We want to grow as professionals. So I don't think we have time to go through my little grammar lesson here, so don't worry about it. I'll just say thank you, and let's get to the questions.
Thanks, Deborah. So yeah, we do have some questions. So I'll go ahead. Whatever we have in the chat, I'll go ahead with that. And after that, if anybody has question, they can speak directly. So here's the first question that's coming from Shrutika. Her question is, many times it happens that when a considerably senior writer reviews content, writers tend to blindly accept the feedback and incorporate. How to encourage writers, especially new writers, to have discussions and use reviews as a channel to learn and brainstorm?
Mm-hmm. Well, and time is sometimes a factor in those kinds of situations as well. If a new writer can sometimes feel very rushed, not only intimidated, which is what I think you're getting at, but also can sometimes feel very rushed, like I have to get this done, I have to get this done. And I've seen that even in senior level writers. I have to get it done, therefore I'm just going to, give up in a certain sense. And incorporate whatever this reviewer has told me to incorporate. And I agree with you. That's sort of shirking their opportunity a little bit to learn. So you might want to. It might fall on the senior person to schedule time and open the discussion with what questions do you have. For instance. I didn't, and again, put your, the senior person might want to put themselves in that sensitive question arena where they're putting themselves in the question. I had trouble understanding this passage about this particular feature, but I'm not sure I captured the right words. Can we maybe talk through it a little bit? So I really think that the idea of your senior person being a mentor, which I think is sort of the direction you were thinking, it falls back on them to maybe have that conversation and have it in a gentle and sensitive way. Does that help?
Thank you, Debra. That helps.
Okay. Other questions?
Yeah, Deborah, one more. In case of peer review, how to draw boundaries so that one doesn't end up rewriting the piece of content altogether?
Well, that's the rub, isn't it? So it goes back to the idea of having a checklist. I think that's where the boundaries are set. You are with your department checklist or maybe the personal checklist that you draw up for this peer review. You telling them this is the boundaries. This is probably your content has already gone through expert review. You've done your part in incorporating and proofreading. And really what you're looking at is feedback on the presentation of the content. And your checklist really should speak to that. I don't have it in front of me, but I used to draw up a checklist, or I had one that I had kept from many years ago in Sun Ed that said here are the things that and that was part of my job, by the way, at Sun Ed, was drawing up checklists. But I would have like check for gross errors, typo, and I'd have typos, spellos, and double periods. And then the next section of the checklist would be check for ambiguity and lack of clarity at the sentence level, and that might be the next section. I'm sorry, I don't have this memorized. And then the next section might be check trademarks, because if it were something that we didn't have an opportunity to run through legal, that the peer review was really there to check for trademarks as well. Check for captions, check for style stuff like capitalization, and check in product names, capitalization in captions. So we had multiple sections in a checklist. And really, sometimes a peer review might go 2 or 3 rounds through a document and focus on one section of your checklist. But I really do think your checklist is your boundary, and that's where you say, check this and nothing else. It really worked for us in SunEd, at least.
Yep. Yeah, completely agree, I think. And checklist is something which is very much following the boundary of the style guide defined by the organization also. So
Yeah.
thank you, Debra. We have another question from this one from Raghavendra. How to handle peer reviews when there is no style guide? And for one situation, 2 peers have a different perspective. And in their view, both are right.
Oh, I feel your pain. So that's a toughie, because you don't know where they're coming from, right? So one way to start the question or start the discussion is to ask each of them, well, what are you using as your resource for markup? What style guide are you referring to? A lot of former journalists, for example, really like the Chicago Manual of Style. A lot of people out there who've been out there for a long time, and technical writers in the technical high-tech industry, they really like that Microsoft style guide. So ask them, what reference are you using? And if you can't get a copy, go borrow one. And then you can have the discussion. Well, which do we want to use as a department? Do we want to use the Chicago Manual of Style? Do we want to use the Microsoft Style Guide? And you could use it as an opportunity to have that discussion. If time is the element, right? That's always driving us here. If it's a thing where you're pressed for time, get them in a room and you all agree on what should happen with the particular, focus in. Again, you always want to focus people on the 5 or 6 questions that you have, and put them in a room and have that discussion about those 5 or 6 options, or 5 or 6 areas where you have that concern. But I really would also use the opportunity to nail down a style guide that you could all use together, or that you all agree on is going to be your style guide going forward.
Thanks, Debra. I think that's very helpful. One more question we have from Gayatri. Writers have to balance everything between deadlines, information sourcing, peer reviews, and SME review comments, and other little things. Given this, how many rounds of peer review on new content is good? Because sometimes editors require to see the doc not just one more time, but we really don't have the time for potential comments.
Right. So that's, and that's where we all want to empower ourselves and manage our own reviews. And I know that's easy to say, but we only, at Oracle, we only did 1 round of peer review. And if there was something that came up that was
Debra, we have lost you. I can't hear you.
I'm sorry, can you hear me now?
Yeah.
All right, somebody somehow muted me, or maybe my computer did. I'm sorry about that. So what I started to say is, at Oracle, we only did 1 round of peer review, and then hashed out any questions that were sort of left over and not obvious from the peer review. If an editor requests that they see it 1 more time, ask them if they're concerned about a particular section, and maybe you just send them that section. Or if they're just concerned about the index, for instance, redo the index and just send them the index. I would put myself in the driver's seat and manage that as much as you can, so that you're not turning over your complete effort again, for a second review, I would really try to manage it to something more focused, if that makes sense.
Certainly, I think. And anybody else has any other question? Otherwise, it's not a question. Raghavendra is just asking to repeat the name of the book which you mentioned in the start of the session.
So the Sun Microsystems book?
Raghavendra?
The one you would refer for the grammatical things.
Style of writing?
Style of writing, yes.
Oh, okay,
some compact, she mentioned, some compact.
Oh, this one. Oh, this one. Okay, this one. Yeah, so the one I pulled up. It's called the Little Brown Compact Handbook. And it's got a bunch of tabs in it that are easy to find grammar questions. That's why I like it. I actually use this when I teach because it's so easy to find answers in. And I honestly don't know. So again, it's the Little Brown Compact Handbook. And Little Brown is actually the name of the publisher. So it comes from Little Brown and Company. And I don't know if this is still in print, but I love it. Another one you might want to consider is if you can't find that one, is the Greg reference manual. We use this one at Sun Microsystems also, and it's also got some tabbed chapters and some good examples. It's got more extensive examples in it. This one does. So this one's called the Greg, G-R-E-G, so three G's in that word, reference manual. Does that help?
Yes, thank you.
Got it, bro. So, Debra, I have from my end just one last question. When we talk about these many reviews, and especially in my view, yes, reviews, other reviews, peer reviews, editorial, and all matters. Probably, even from your presentation, it's very clear that self-review is the key thing. If that's done properly, probably other cycles will reduce, the comments will be less. So when we talk about a checklist for self-review, considering that the company already has a style guide, what are your recommendations for a new writer or for anyone to prepare a self-review checklist? What all they should consider?
I might have a checklist that I could send to you guys, but I'm not sure. What I would, I guess what I would do is go through, is do a couple of rounds of review. If it's what I would do is I would scan the document for any of those gross errors. So any place where I do double periods and it's just kind of silly. And I just kind of scan do a quick read through to try to find any place where I've really messed up, had a spello, and do that first. So get your gross errors kind of under control first. Run your spell checker or your grammar checker and look where it's picked up on some of those gross errors. And then the next thing that I would do is focus on clarity. So I would then do a clarity review, and you don't have to necessarily review the whole document, but places where the technical content is particularly complex or particularly dense, do that review where you're reading it out loud or reading that section backwards, like I explained from that last sentence to the beginning of the sentence, and really focus on, am I being clear? So that would be the second question that I would ask myself as I'm doing my self-edit. And then do a check for consistency. So consistency actually takes two different forms. One is consistency of terminology. So you're calling the same thing with using the same term. And in technical writing, that's what we have to do. We have to use the same term all the way through, right? So if you called it a storage device to begin with, you're not calling it a storage system 4 sections later. So that would be a consistency review for terminology. And then do your consistency review for style. And you can either do those at the same time or do them on a, you know, a third, basically a third round through your document. But so I would do gross errors first, clarity next, and then your consistency check, and consistency for style and terminology, and then run the whole thing through your style checker again.
Thanks, Debra. That's very helpful. So I think we're done with the questions, and I think we don't have any more questions also, and we are already running out of time.
Yes.
So thank
Sorry.
you very much, Debra. I think this is very helpful session. We got to learn some new perspective about reviews also. So thank you again for
And
your
if
time.
anybody has some additional,
Yeah.
I'm sorry. I was going to say, if people think of questions and they come up afterwards, if you want to email me, I have my email address here, Debra@dkconsultingcolorado.com.